Have you ever walked into a room and without anyone speaking a word, immediately felt something was off? Everything looks normal. People are smiling, chatting, laughing. But you can feel the undercurrent and emotional tension that no one is acknowledging. You don't hear it. You don't see it. But somehow you know. You know that one person's laughter is masking deep sorrow. You can sense the quiet anxiety in the confident speaker. You detect resentment behind polite smiles and insecurity behind arrogant postures. Most people wouldn't notice any of this. But for you, it's impossible not to notice. You can't unsee it. If this resonates, you may be part of the rarest psychological type Carl Jung ever identified, what he called the introverted intuitive with differentiated perception. These individuals don't just observe the world, they read it, feel it, absorb it. They walk through life like human antennas, unconsciously tuned into the hidden emotional and psychological signals of everyone around them. But here's the shocking part: Jung didn't see this as a strength. He called it his most dangerous discovery, because people who perceive too much often end up suffering silently. The danger, Jung wrote, lies not in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it causes. When you see what others can't or won't, you become a mirror. And most people aren't ready to look into that mirror. They either reject you, fear you, or attack you for showing them parts of themselves they'd rather keep buried. This video isn't about mental illness. It's about a level of mental clarity so intense, so uncommon, that it becomes alienating, even threatening to the society around it. This is Carl Jung's most haunting psychological insight. And if you recognize yourself in what you're hearing, you're not broken. You're different in a way that few understand, but many desperately need. The year was 1913. Carl Jung, at the peak of his early career, had just experienced the most painful rupture of his professional life, his dramatic split from Sigmund Freud. To the outside world, Jung remained the rising star of depth psychology. But internally, he was descending into what he later called a confrontation with the unconscious. He was plagued by visions, dreams, and a psychological fragmentation that threatened to consume him. And then, in the midst of his personal psychological crisis, she appeared. She wasn't a famous case. Her name is lost to history. But in Jung's private notes, she remains unforgettable. She came to him withdrawn, soft-spoken, and unusually perceptive. She didn't complain about ordinary neuroses. Instead, she described things she shouldn't know. Not in a psychic or mystical way, but in a startlingly accurate, emotionally precise, psychologically sharp way. She would describe how someone was feeling before they even admitted it. She could intuit people's inner conflicts just by being near them. She would say, "He's angry with his wife," or "She's hiding something," and Jung, curious, would later confirm her impressions to be astonishingly true. The patient displays an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, Jung wrote. But this faculty appears to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't keep friends. Not because she was rude or cold, but because people felt exposed in her presence. She couldn't keep a job. Not because she was incompetent, but because her presence disturbed the unspoken agreements that allowed social systems to function. She couldn't even make small talk. Not because she lacked social skills, but because she saw through everything. Every mask, every pretense, every lie people told themselves and each other, she perceived them instantly. At first, Jung suspected psychosis. But she wasn't delusional. She wasn't hallucinating. She was clear, consistent, and emotionally grounded. In fact, she was often more accurate in her assessments than any of his other patients or peers. She didn't suffer from a psychological disorder. She suffered from too much perception. This patient became the foundation for one of Jung's most profound insights, that some individuals possess what he called differentiated perception, a type of highly evolved intuition that allows them to read the unconscious content of others as if it were printed on their faces. But it came at a cost. She lived in a state of constant psychological overload. She absorbed other people's emotions as if they were her own. She felt other people's secrets, tensions, and shadows in her body. She speaks of others as if she has access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations, Jung noted. When I verify her observations through careful questioning, they prove remarkably accurate. This was not a pathology, it was a mirror. She reflected the unconscious mind of everyone around her. And people couldn't handle that. Jung later coined the term participation mystique to describe this phenomenon when the psychological boundaries between individuals begin to dissolve and one person begins to carry the unconscious burdens of many. He wrote, "There are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment." This realization terrified Jung, because it meant that people like her, people with advanced psychological sensitivity, were walking among us unseen, misunderstood and systematically rejected by the very societies they were trying to function in. Worse, he discovered a pattern. These individuals often become scapegoats in group dynamics. They are accused of creating drama, when in truth they are revealing what others refuse to confront. They are dismissed as too sensitive, when in fact they are too accurate. Their insight becomes a threat, their presence a disruption, their honesty a mirror too sharp for most people to face. This anonymous patient marked the beginning of Jung's lifelong exploration into the psychology of those who see too much. She wasn't just one case. She was a type, the first glimpse into a rare and dangerous form of perception that modern psychology still struggles to understand. And from that moment, Jung knew the greatest threat to a society built on unconsciousness is the person who sees it clearly. As Carl Jung continued studying patients like the intuitive woman who had opened his eyes to a deeper psychological reality, he began to notice something fascinating. Not all highly perceptive people were the same. They didn't all process their intuitions in the same way. They didn't all carry the same burdens. And most importantly, they didn't all break down in the same way. Some were emotionally overwhelmed by the feelings of others. Some became eerily accurate in predicting events before they happened. Some developed physical symptoms from other people's stress. And some simply became lost in the flood of unconscious content they could not understand or control. This led Jung to expand his typology. He realized that while these people shared a core function, introverted intuition, they each expressed it differently depending on which secondary psychological function accompanied it. Jung eventually identified 4 core subtypes of what he called differentiated intuitives. Each one represents a unique way that unconscious content is perceived and processed. And each one faces a different kind of danger. Type 1, the feeling intuitive. This is the person who doesn't just sense what others feel, they literally feel it themselves. When someone in the room is sad, they feel sadness. When someone else is angry, they feel heat in their own body. They pick up emotions like static electricity, and their own feelings are constantly shaped by the people around them. They have a highly developed feeling function paired with introverted intuition. This means they understand emotions deeply, and their intuition allows them to detect feelings that others are not even aware of in themselves. Jung described them as living in a state of emotional contagion. They often struggle to separate their own emotional experience from that of others. Without strong boundaries, this type can drown in emotional overload. These people are often seen as highly empathetic or deeply compassionate, but the cost is immense. Without conscious training, they are vulnerable to emotional burnout, depression, and anxiety. Their nervous system is constantly processing pain that doesn't belong to them, and it leaves them exhausted. Type 2, the thinking intuitive. This type is analytical, strategic, and astonishingly predictive. Their introverted intuition is supported by a well-developed thinking function. This allows them to process patterns, anticipate consequences, and draw unconscious information into logical conclusions. They might sense that a relationship is headed toward collapse, or that a company will soon fail months before anyone else can see it. They don't necessarily have more data, they simply perceive patterns that others miss. Their gift lies in clarity, but their burden lies in timing. They often see what others are not ready to acknowledge. When they warn people, they're accused of being negative, cold, or overthinking. But in time, their predictions usually come true. Jung noticed that these individuals often become socially alienated. Not because they're wrong, but because they're right too early. And that premature insight makes people uncomfortable. If the thinking intuitive fails to develop humility and patience, they can become cynical, emotionally detached, and even arrogant. Their mental clarity can turn into intellectual isolation. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. These people perceive unconscious content through the body. They pick up subtle shifts in tone movement, posture, and energy. Their physical senses are attuned to emotional truth. They might notice that someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes, or they may feel tension in their own shoulders that reflects someone else's unspoken stress. In some cases, they can detect illness fatigue or emotional repression before any outward signs appear. Jung considered these individuals to be warning systems. They often become aware of psychological or physical issues long before they are acknowledged consciously. The problem is that their bodies become the battleground. They are prone to mysterious health symptoms, chronic fatigue, or pain that has no clear medical cause. Often these symptoms are somatizations of the emotions they're absorbing from others. Unless they learn grounding techniques and develop healthy physical boundaries, they are at risk of psychosomatic overload. Their bodies carry what their minds cannot process. Type 4. The pure intuitive. This is the rarest and most overwhelmed subtype. These individuals possess deep introverted intuition, but lack a clearly developed secondary function to help structure or express what they perceive. They are flooded with impressions, insights, and unconscious material, but cannot easily make sense of it. They may have vivid dreams, emotional surges, and spiritual insights, but struggle to articulate them. Their minds are rich with meaning, but it's often incoherent to others and even to themselves. Jung described them as living in a state of near-permanent psychological overwhelm. They are easily mistaken for unstable, overly sensitive, or strange. In reality, they are absorbing more information than they can consciously manage. For this type, developing structure is a matter of survival. They need grounding routine and a supportive environment that helps them organize what they perceive. Without this, they can become lost in confusion, dissociation, or existential despair. Why this matters? Jung's discovery of these 4 intuitive types was not just an academic breakthrough. It was a roadmap for understanding people who feel like misfits in a world that values surface over depth. Each of these types represents a form of advanced perception. None of them are dysfunctional by nature, but all of them become dangerous to themselves and others if their perception remains unconscious, unmanaged, or rejected. The key is not to suppress your perception, but to integrate it. In the next part of this series, we'll explore the 3 major dangers Jung identified when superior perception goes unintegrated, and why they so often lead to isolation, psychological collapse, or social rejection. Let's now enter the dark forest Jung warned about, the cost of seeing too clearly. By now, it's clear that highly perceptive individuals are not just gifted with insight, they are burdened by it. And Jung, more than any psychologist of his time, understood just how devastating that burden could become when not handled with care. He had watched it play out repeatedly in his patients. These were not people suffering from ordinary neuroses or childhood trauma. They were suffering from something deeper, the inability to exist peacefully in a world that did not want to be seen. After years of clinical observation and personal experience, Jung identified 3 core dangers that consistently emerged in individuals with highly differentiated perception. These dangers, he believed, were not just personal, they threatened the psychological health of the collective as well. Danger 1. Collective unconscious disruption. Jung believed that societies are held together by what he called unconscious agreements, shared illusions, stories, and blind spots that allow people to function as a group. These agreements are not logical. They are emotional, symbolic, and largely invisible. People agree without ever discussing it to avoid certain truths. The highly perceptive individual disrupts these agreements simply by being present, because they see through the illusions. They detect the lies in leadership, the dysfunction in families, the contradictions in culture. They bring unconscious material into the light, often without meaning to. And when that happens, the system reacts. Not with gratitude, but with hostility. Jung wrote that the person who sees too clearly becomes a threat to group cohesion. They are labeled as troublemakers, too intense, too sensitive, or not a team player. But in truth, their only crime is refusing to pretend not to notice what everyone else is ignoring. This is why so many of these individuals are pushed out of groups, families, or organizations. Their presence threatens the unconscious fabric that keeps those systems intact. Danger 2. Psychological isolation. The second, and perhaps most painful danger, is isolation. When your mind operates on a different level than the people around you, it creates a deep and persistent loneliness. Jung described this as the curse of superior function. Your greatest strength becomes your greatest barrier. You speak, but people don't understand. You share your insights, but they feel threatened instead of helped. So you withdraw. Not because you want to, but because interaction becomes too costly. You begin to hide your perceptions. You pretend not to see. You stay quiet even when you know something is deeply wrong. And over time, that silence eats away at your soul. Jung wrote, "The individual with differentiated perception becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness." And unlike ordinary loneliness, this isolation is existential. It's not just about not being understood. It's about feeling like you live in a different psychological reality altogether. Some people deal with this by becoming arrogant or elitist. Others become depressed or self-destructive. Some retreat into spiritual bypassing, using mystical language to escape the pain. But the root problem remains the same. They see what others can't, and it leaves them deeply alone. Danger 3. Identity dissolution. The final and most dangerous threat is the loss of self. Jung noticed that many highly perceptive people had no stable psychological boundary. They absorbed so much unconscious material from others that they could no longer tell where they ended and others began. This leads to what Jung called participation mystique, a state where the individual becomes psychologically merged with the collective unconscious. They carry other people's grief, shame, fear, and projections, and slowly lose their sense of who they truly are. Jung warned that this isn't just painful, it's annihilating. The person loses contact with their own authentic identity. They become a psychic sponge reacting to everything around them, but grounded in nothing. And over time, this can lead to fragmentation, depersonalization, or even full psychological breakdown. This was the most tragic outcome Jung witnessed. People born with extraordinary sensitivity and awareness, who because they never learned to integrate it, were eventually overwhelmed by it. They weren't destroyed by what they saw. They were destroyed by not knowing how to live with what they saw. Jung believed this danger was not theoretical. It was happening all around us. In artists, empaths, mystics, therapists, and visionaries who crumbled under the weight of their own insight. In children who were too aware for their age. In adults who could never quite function in a world built on shallow interactions and hidden pain. The more he studied this phenomenon, the more convinced he became. The problem wasn't the perception. The problem was the lack of psychological tools to handle it. And so Jung devoted much of his work to solving this problem. He knew that the only way to protect the perceptive mind was to teach it how to integrate what it sees. That's where his most important psychological model comes in. The process of individuation. In the next part, we'll explore this powerful framework, how Jung taught people to stay conscious, stay grounded, and transform their perception from a burden into a gift. Because what you see may never change, but how you carry what you see that can change everything. Carl Jung believed that the solution to the dangers of superior perception was not suppression denial or isolation. The answer was integration. Conscious, structured, psychological integration. And so he developed what may be his most important contribution to modern psychology, the process of individuation. To Jung, individuation is the process of becoming truly yourself. Not the version of you that fits into society, not the version molded by your family, your culture, or your trauma, but the version of you that reflects your deepest, most authentic psychological essence. For highly perceptive individuals, this process is not optional, it's survival. Because without integration, their perception becomes toxic. It overwhelms them, it isolates them, and in some cases, it destroys them. Jung outlined a three-phase framework that could help individuals with differentiated perception develop psychological structure, emotional boundaries, and a healthier relationship with the unconscious. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. The first step is to recognize what you are actually experiencing. Many highly perceptive people are unaware that they are absorbing unconscious content from others. They assume every thought, every emotion, every sensation belongs to them. This leads to confusion, overwhelm, and misdiagnosis. Jung called this the need for conscious discrimination, the ability to differentiate between what is yours and what is not. He instructed patients to begin noticing when their emotional state changed in the presence of others. Were they suddenly anxious after a conversation? Did they feel heavy around a certain person? Did sadness arise for no reason? Often, these were not signs of internal instability, but signals that they had absorbed something from their environment. Jung believed that solitude was essential for this phase. He advised his patients to spend time alone every day, without distractions, to let external content settle and reveal what truly belonged to them. Only by observing yourself in stillness can you begin to hear your own voice beneath the noise of others. Phase 2, shadow integration. Once you've learned to separate your experience from others, the next step is to face what's inside you. Many people with superior perception focus outward. They see the flaws, fears, and shadows of others clearly, but struggle to acknowledge their own. This creates a dangerous imbalance. Jung warned that projecting one's shadow onto others is a defense mechanism. And for perceptive individuals, it can become a trap. You may become so focused on seeing what's wrong in others that you never confront what's undeveloped or denied within yourself. Jung called this work shadow integration. He wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward. Shadow integration involves acknowledging your own capacity for everything you see in others. If you sense manipulation, ask yourself how you manipulate. If you detect anger, explore your own suppressed rage. This doesn't mean you're bad or broken. It means you're human. And wholeness requires embracing all of your humanity, not just the parts that are easy to accept. The more you own your own shadow, the less triggered you become by the shadow of others, and the less likely you are to take responsibility for emotions that are not yours. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase of individuation is what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious. This means being able to engage with others, perceive their unconscious material, and even hold space for their shadows without being overwhelmed, lost, or destabilized by it. To do this, Jung believed you had to develop what he called psychological containers. These are inner structures, rituals, practices, relationships, creative outlets that allow you to hold the emotional and psychological material of others temporarily, without internalizing it as your own. In other words, you become a witness, not a carrier. You might feel someone's pain, but you no longer become consumed by it. You might sense someone's lies, but you don't feel responsible for exposing or fixing them. You become capable of deep empathy without self-erasure. This phase also requires community. Jung believed that no one completes individuation alone. He emphasized the importance of finding what he called the few who understand people who are psychologically mature enough to hold space for your insights without defensiveness. He wrote that the individuated person is recognized immediately by another individuated person. There is a sense of authenticity, presence, and mutual respect that cannot be faked. Finding these people is rare, but essential, because the goal is not to become some mystical loner floating above the world. The goal is to remain fully human, deeply present, and consciously engaged with the world without losing yourself to it. The power of integration. For Jung, successful individuation is the difference between being consumed by your perception and being empowered by it. It doesn't mean you stop seeing. It means you stop suffering from what you see. You become grounded in your identity. You develop emotional resilience, and you transform your perception into wisdom that can serve not only yourself, but others as well. Because perception without integration leads to collapse. But perception with integration leads to contribution. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when people fail to integrate, how many gifted individuals fall into the traps Jung warned about. From spiritual arrogance to emotional codependency, the path of perception is filled with subtle dangers. And knowing how to spot them may save your mind and your mission. Even with the right tools, the path of psychological integration is not easy. Highly perceptive people face unique internal and external pressures. And without careful attention, they often fall into subtle but dangerous traps that derail their growth and disconnect them from their authentic purpose. Jung observed many of these traps in his patients. These were not failures of intelligence or willpower. They were misunderstandings of their own nature, of the role their perception plays, and of how to live in a world that doesn't always welcome deep consciousness. Here are 4 of the most common pitfalls that highly perceptive people fall into. Pitfall 1. Psychological inflation. This is one of the most dangerous and seductive traps for the perceptive mind. When someone sees more than others, it's easy to believe they are better, wiser, or more evolved. The ego begins to identify with the archetype of the seer, the prophet, or the healer. At first, this feels empowering. You feel special. You feel like you have a mission. You want to share your insights with others, maybe even save them from their blindness. But over time, this turns into what Jung called psychological inflation. The ego becomes swollen with the power of perception. You stop listening. You stop learning. You start preaching. This often alienates others and isolates the individual in a prison of superiority. People no longer connect with you. They either idolize or avoid you. And in both cases, you become disconnected from your own humanity. Jung warned that the moment you believe you are the bearer of absolute truth, you are no longer serving the collective. You are being possessed by the very unconscious forces you think you understand. Pitfall 2. Withdrawal and avoidance. The opposite of inflation is retreat. Some highly perceptive individuals become so disillusioned by society's resistance to depth that they give up entirely. They isolate themselves, not just socially, but psychologically. They stop sharing. They stop engaging. They decide the world is too unconscious, too shallow, too toxic to be worth participating in. On the surface, this can look like wisdom. It may even be framed as spiritual detachment. But Jung saw it for what it truly is: avoidance. A defense mechanism that protects the individual from pain, but also prevents them from growing. The world may not be easy for the perceptive person, but complete withdrawal is not a sign of strength. It is a symptom of overwhelm. True individuation, Jung taught, involves conscious engagement. You don't have to fix the world, but you do have to stay in relationship with it. Pitfall 3. The helper identity. Many perceptive people fall into the trap of defining themselves by how much they can help others. They become therapists, coaches, healers, or counselors, formally or informally. Their identity becomes fused with being the one who sees, the one who understands, the one who supports. But over time, this can become a prison, because the more they define themselves through service, the more they neglect their own development. They give without limit. They sacrifice rest, silence, and solitude. And eventually, they burn out not just emotionally, but existentially. Jung warned that when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. You become a role, a mirror, a tool. And in that process, you forget how to be fully human. The antidote is balance. Yes, you can help others, but you must also allow yourself to be supported, to rest, to receive, and to be seen not just for what you can give, but for who you are. Pitfall 4. Regression under pressure. Even those who successfully integrate their perception can regress under stress. Life brings challenges, loss, trauma, transition. And during these times, it's common for perceptive individuals to lose their boundaries, to stop practicing self-care, to forget what they've learned. They begin absorbing too much again. They get flooded with other people's emotions. They start feeling lost, heavy, or disconnected from their center. Jung emphasized that integration is not a one-time achievement. It's a living process. It requires daily attention, self-reflection, and support. He advised his patients to develop practices that help them stay anchored, time in solitude to process what they're feeling, creative outlets to express the unconscious without becoming overwhelmed by it, relationships with people who understand their depth and can offer reality checks, shadow work to continually examine their own unconscious material. Without these practices, even the most evolved person can slide back into confusion. Understanding these pitfalls is not about judgment. It's about awareness. Because if you can name the trap, you are far less likely to fall into it. And if you do fall in, you'll know how to climb out. In the final part of this series, we'll explore the real purpose of this gift, the evolutionary role that people with superior perception are here to play in the collective. Because this journey isn't just about surviving your perception. It's about transforming it into something that helps others awaken too. Carl Jung did not believe that people with superior perception were cursed. He believed they were called, not by society, not by fame, not by recognition, but by consciousness itself. He saw them as psychological forerunners, individuals who were born to see through illusion, to question unconscious patterns, and to sense what others denied. They weren't broken. They were early. Jung wrote that the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, not the crowd, not the institution, but the one person who dares to feel what's been forgotten, to think what's been forbidden, and to say what others are afraid to say. If you've ever felt out of place in this world, too deep, too sensitive, too aware, it's not because you're wrong. It's because the world has not yet learned how to welcome people like you. But that is changing. We are entering a time in human history where deep perception is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. Where unconscious behavior is no longer sustainable. Where people are beginning to ask bigger questions about truth, connection, purpose, and transformation. And that is where you come in. Your gift is not here to separate you. It's here to serve. But not in a way that drains you or silences you. In a way that helps you become more of who you are, fully, freely, and consciously. Integration is not about shrinking your light. It's about learning how to shine it wisely. You are not here to fix everyone. You are here to embody what's possible. When consciousness is lived with courage. The next stage of human evolution is psychological, not technological. It will be led not by machines, but by awake minds and open hearts. And that includes you. You don't need permission to be who you are. You only need support, clarity, and the will to walk your path with your eyes open. So take what you see. Let it shape you, strengthen you, and soften you. And then when you're ready, offer it. Because this world needs what you've always seen, even if it doesn't realize it yet.